So before I share the screen, I just kind of want to introduce myself, everyone. I'm Sarah Watson. So I am the Maps and Geospatial Services Manager for UK Libraries. So that means that I work with our in-house map collection, which is about 250,000 items. That includes historical and contemporary maps and aerial imagery. And then along with working with those materials, I also do kind of GIS related work. So that includes things like this workshop and kind of different GIS projects. And if you're interested in learning about GIS and don't really know where to start, feel free to reach out to me and I can do my best to try to help you. So with that said, let me go ahead and share my screen. And all right, can you guys see that okay? Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, awesome. So today's topic is ArcGIS story maps. And this is part of the larger MedCenter research workshop series. So you may be wondering, what are story maps? So what are they? They're a digital platform. So they're kind of similar to a blog post in that they have a scrolling structure where you add text, audio, images, maps, video, different things like that to tell a larger story to your audience. And story maps are part of the Esri suite. So Esri is the kind of big company that oversees a lot of GIS tools and platforms. So that includes things like desktop GIS software. Some of you may be familiar with ArcGIS or ArcPro. They also have an online mapping tool that's ArcGIS Online. And within that kind of online cloud-based kind of tool set, story maps is a part of that. So if you work with story maps, you'll probably find yourself also working with ArcGIS Online, and they kind of have other different tools as well. So Esri is kind of one of the big companies that does work with GIS right now. So one thing to be aware of as you kind of jump into the world of story maps is there are two different platforms. There's what they call a classic platform and then the new current platform. So we're going to focus on the new current one. But if you've looked at story maps previously, maybe even made story maps, you might have made them in the classic model. Some people are diehard lovers of the classic model. So Esri is continuing to offer kind of limited technical support, and it's not doing away with those classic builders. But if you're new to the world of story maps, it's probably best to jump into kind of the current builder. And they have done a lot of developments over the past year to kind of incorporate some of the features that people liked in the classic builder models. So at this point, you can pretty much do everything in the new one that you could have done in the classic ones. You might be asking yourself, do you have to use maps? Do you have to make maps to use StoryMap? And you don't. I occasionally work with folks who really like the kind of simplicity of the design and customization features, and that they aren't really interested in maps. So they kind of use story maps just as a online builder for photos and text and audio and video, and they kind of ignore the map side of it, which is fine. I would suggest that most stories have a geographical component, so you could incorporate a map in some capacity, but you don't have to. So I linked here to a few different examples. When this is shared with you all, you can kind of look through these, but just to give you a sense of one of them, this is kind of a very classic looking story map. So it opens with an image, there's a title, there's a subtitle, there's the authors, and then you can kind of jump into the heart of the story. So you can see here they're incorporating a lot of text. They have some images as well. And then they kind of bring in this kind of map facet to their work, right? So they kind of are fusing together imagery, text, and then the map, right? And it's this scrolling model, right, where you're moving down on the page as you continue to scroll with your mouse, and the map moves with you as you move through it. So you can see, right, it's very clean, it's very polished. To make something like this doesn't require any kind of coding experience or anything like that. So it's very user-friendly. And Esri has a lot of tutorials and kind of online help. So that's another feature that's nice if you want to kind of work with this type of platform, is you can typically find assistance to kind of do what you want to do. So we can kind of see how they have multiple maps and images here. and they're able to kind of assemble something that's very polished and kind of sophisticated looking. So if we jump back, in terms of creating an account, so Esri does have limited free public accounts that you can make with just an email address, but you're not going to get all of the customization features. So if you really want to kind of jump into the deep end and be able to do the most with your story map, you're probably going to rely upon the UK Esri educational license package. You could, in theory, purchase your own license with Esri, but if you're affiliated with UK, you do have access to the educational license. One thing to note, though, is just the kind of inherent complexity when you start using university-owned software. There is kind of the caveat that your data and materials that you upload are kind of technically the property of the university, and if you envision leaving UK at some point, whether it be because you graduate or whatever happens, and you want to take the material with you, it can be very difficult, if not impossible, to do that. So just kind of that necessary caveat that this is it's nice to have that access as someone affiliated with UK, but there are just certain kind of pros and cons that you do have to weigh. So just a few other little things to note. You can collaborate with story maps. Typically that requires you to be part of the same organization. So in this case, if you and your colleague are both UK members, you can be, it's easier for you to kind of form a group because you're part of the same kind of umbrella organization. There are some ways you can collaborate with people who are at other institutions. It's just a little messier to set that up. You can generate PDFs, which is not something you necessarily want to do, right? Like part of the power of story maps is that it's interactive and there's kind of these dynamic features, but you can create surprisingly clean PDFs. So if you were envisioning kind of sharing something maybe with students, or some reason where you kind of need a paper copy, or even if you just want to kind of build a kind of non-dynamic archive of the story maps you make, the PDFs are pretty good. You can incorporate Google Analytics. So if you are interested in tracking users, how many views your story maps are getting, you can pretty easily incorporate that. Esri has invested a lot over the past few years in accessibility, kind of web accessibility, and then different language support. So you can kind of reach the widest audience possible with your story maps, and you have the kind of Esri customer service support if you run into issues with that. One thing I do want to note is long-term preservation is not guaranteed, right? So this is a problem with any kind of online software, online kind of platform, but it is something to kind of think about. If you're making something that you kind of are hoping is going to essentially live forever, story maps is probably not the best place to do that. So just something to be mindful of as you consider making a story map. And then if you are curious about the kind of world of story maps and some of the different features and changes, they do have a blog that is regularly updated. And it's basically monthly that they're unveiling new features, new support. So it is a very dynamic platform for the creator as well. So are there any just initial questions about any of this stuff? Well, you probably noticed that this is a story map. So this is kind of one way that you can very easily kind of share information, right, is with this type of story map. And I did this because I'm going to use this as kind of a playground to show you some of the different features that you can incorporate into your story map. So this is what it looks like when you're on the creator side. You can see here at the top, it has an edit story. It has my, anonymous little icon there with my information. And if I click on edit story, it's going to take me into the platform to actually kind of do everything I want to do. So just some general kind of layout stuff to be aware of. Up here at the top, you can have a logo that appears. You'll see the title of your story map. You'll see if it's published or if it's still in draft form. It auto saves, which is a lovely feature of the new current story map. The classic builder did not auto save, so a lot of problems could arise. And then over here, you have some of the different features for design and kind of customizing your story map. So if we click on this first option here, you can see that You're given 3 different options for your cover, and you can kind of play around with these as much as you want without losing any information. So if you want to flip between different colors and things like that, you can do that without kind of making a permanent change. So we can see here, if we select the first option, it's going to put that image behind the cover text. The last option is going to put the image above the cover text, and then that middle option is kind of putting them next to one another. You can see here that there are these 2 different buttons you can turn on and off. This first one, the navigation, that allows you to create these kind of chapter headings that stay at the top of your page, and if you click on them, it takes you to that specific section. So this is really handy if you have a bigger story to tell and you have a lot of different pieces. You might not want your viewer to have to scroll forever to get to the specific section that's most important to them. So you can use the navigation to allow them to jump ahead or to jump back if they want to. There's also a credits button that allows you to put the name of some of your collaborators, to include different information about where you got your images and things like that. There's also a sorted theme. So Esri right now is supplying 6 kind of default options that allows you to change the color and the font of your story map. So again, you can kind of play around with which one you like the best very easily. But sometimes you need a little more than that. And so one of the newer things that came out in like the last maybe 6-7 months is you actually can build your own theme, which is kind of interesting. So if you go to this manage theme option right here, it's going to open up a new window. You can see some of the themes I've kind of played around with that I've saved. And then if you click new theme right here, it's going to take you into the builder. And so what you see is just some like sample text, and you have these options here to decide to customize. So if you select colors, you can pick any color, you know, in the rainbow that you want for your background. You know, this is where design theory comes into play. Do be somewhat deliberate in your choices. While the kind of neon map background may seem appealing, it can be hard on the eyes, right? So you do need to kind of think a little carefully about some of those design choices, but it is really nice that you can kind of pick anything. And if you have a specific hex code that you want to work with, you can just auto input it right there and get that specific color. You can then also select accent colors. So this would be kind of the buttons, some of the other little things that you can then change as well. Additional accent colors you can mess with. And then just a couple other things to point out, you can select different fonts and then different font colors. So depending on how dark your background is, you might want to make your font a lighter color, right? You might want to go more white with a dark background rather than having kind of the more black color. And this is something that's like less than a month old, is they have integrated Google Fonts, which basically gives you, you know, any font you want to use. So you can scroll through here and you know, look at the different fonts and kind of select ones that you find most appealing or that you think look nice with the rest of your story map. And again, you know, a light touch is oftentimes recommended, right? You maybe don't want to select different fonts for all of these different categories. That can just kind of be visually overwhelming. So, you know, spend some time thinking about what will be easy for your viewers to understand. You can see there's a little bit of customization with the buttons if you want kind of a standard rectangle or kind of a softer edge. There's a little bit of features with quotes, links, separators. The one thing with the separators, so this is referring to these lines here that if you kind of want to partition out parts of your story, you can select different options. You can also upload an option. So that's really nice if you have some different graphics that kind of fit into your story. You can upload them very easily, and then that would be what would display here. And then finally, if you have a kind of permanent logo that you want associated with a specific theme, you can add that as well. So once you're happy with what you've made, you'll see that it auto-saves, it listed as a draft. Once you publish it, it then is available to actually use in a story map. So I'm not going to publish this. The kind of mustard green color is not really what I would maybe go with. But you can see here under your themes that it does save it as a draft, and then once it's been published, it appears as published. So let's say you have one that you actually want to pull into your story map. If you go back to the design options here and select browse themes, you can then see the ones listed right here. So you can then, select one and it appears with the other Esri default options, and then you can see if you like it or if you want to change it out. So I'm going to just keep it nice and white and clean. And so the next thing just to highlight is you do have a preview option, which is super handy if you're working with students or with people who might be looking at your story map on a mobile phone, because it does give you a sense for what that will look like. And it's relatively clean, but sometimes the more interactive map features do not display particularly well. So it's something just to be mindful of, that you do probably want to double check that you're making something that will be easy for people to understand if you anticipate a lot of people looking at it with a cell phone. We go back to edit and then publish, right, which is pretty self-explanatory. When you get to the point that you're done with your story, you want to share it, you can then publish it. And then just a couple other things here to point out in the general settings. If you select story settings, this is where you would input that Google Analytics. You can hide any social media sharing icons. So once you've published your story, it kind of defaults to those icons. If for some reason you don't want people easily sharing your story on social media, you can use that. And then you can decide whether or not to display a date. So that's kind of the kind of basic skeleton to your story map. And then if you actually get into the creation of it, you can see here, anytime you upload an image, you're going to have these kind of edit icons that appear here at the top. So it gives you the option to recenter an image. So this is nice if you've added a larger image and it kind of auto fits it, but you really kind of want the viewer's eyes to be, focused at the bottom part or the top part. You can change that, and it kind of gives you a sense for what it will look like on a phone versus a laptop. You can then put in any names of the authors or anything that you need to kind of attribute. And then here is where you would input kind of alternative text or kind of accessibility purposes. And you can see here, if you do put the name of like the creator or anything, it kind of puts that little eye icon that people can then click on. You can then also replace or delete really easily. So let me jump below this and go ahead and add a content block. So, there's a lot of help provided by Esri. So you can see when you go over any of these icons, it kind of tells you what their purpose is. So if you ever get twisted around, you can very easily find your way. So if you just select text, you can see it just gives you the option to start typing. And then if you want to make it bold or embed a URL or change the color, you can just highlight that text. You also have the option to make it a heading, a subheading, a bullet, numbered, a quote, things like that. So if you want to create text that is tied to the navigation bar here at the top, you do that by making it a heading. So you can see here, if I highlight this and turn it into a heading, it auto-populates that navigation bar. So it's pretty straightforward, but it also does mean if you're utilizing this feature, you want to be very deliberate in what you make a heading. So that way this is not confusing to your viewer. So the button is a kind of clean way to direct people to an external website. You can see that it's very visible, very highlighted. So if I, let me get that out of the way. If I just grab the library website, you can see I can put it there. Make it something that kind of looks like that people can click on and it'll take them out. So pretty easy. And just again, to kind of show you the image option, it's again, if you've ever kind of worked with most design websites, this is all pretty self-explanatory, right? That you're just kind of adding an image. It auto loads. You have some limited design options here at the top that if you want to move it to the side and put text next to it, if you want to kind of keep it in the middle or expand it, you can kind of select these different options as well. Again, you can put alternative text and then you can replace or delete it as necessary. But one new feature, and by new, this again is like 2 weeks old, is they have introduced an image gallery, which is super nice. Previously, you would have had to make something like this in Photoshop and save it as kind of one image and then pull it into StoryMap. So this is a really easy way that you can have a bunch of images by each other. So you can see here, here's some assorted images. You can, I think, add up to 12. And then once you create gallery, it auto aligns them. And you can change the arrangement if you want to have them appear in a different order. You can add additional ones. You can, again, kind of change how big they are. You can also edit each individual image, which is super nice. So again, if you want to change the center point of one of the specific images, you can do that, which is super nice. And you also have the ability to do what they call either the jigsaw or the dynamic squares, where it cuts everything up into squares. So it's a little limited, right? You can't just kind of do endless things, but it does give you a nice way to kind of combine images, yet still keep it pretty tight so you don't have someone scrolling forever because you want them to see a bunch of assorted photos. Right. So then the next option, I'm going to skip over the video and audio because that's pretty self-explanatory. But the swipe option is also really nice. So if you have 2 different images or 2 different maps, perhaps at the same location, but at different points in time, you can put them next to one another and then you can drag the middle bar to show them. So just a quick example here. These are 2 scanned images of a map, kind of the West 6 area here in Lexington. They don't overlay perfectly, but it's pretty close. So you can see that you can kind of drag, this is, I believe, 1970, and then this is 1934, and you can kind of reposition them if you need to kind of direct the eye. So that's a really nice feature. You can also do this with maps. So if you worked and added any maps to ArcGIS Online, again, it's those ArcGIS Online and StoryMaps are tied to one another. So you can look through and decide to add something. So if I click here, just as a quick example, you can see it shows this topographic map. It's 2 different layers, right? You'll see the layers here to the side where one is 67 and one is 54. I turn off the 67, you can see the 54. And then I can place that side. I can pull in that same map, but then just flip off the bottom layer. And they should overlay pretty neatly, and then you can again move between them and see how much the landscape changed between those 2 periods of time. And so the next feature is just a classic map, which, right, this is why you came to this, is for the map stuff. So you can see, again, if you have maps in ArcGIS Online, you can pull those in. But one of the really nice things to StoryMaps that makes it very user-friendly is they have this option for what they call express maps. So this allows you to make pretty basic but polished looking maps without needing any sort of GIS knowledge at all. It's just kind of point, click, drag, and you've made something that looks pretty nice. So you can see that it defaults to this kind of gray-white world map. You have the option to change that. So you can see there's a decent amount of different maps you can select. You also can select aerial imagery. If that makes the most sense, you can kind of do sort of a classic schoolroom kind of map. So you can pick whatever you want. You then have these different customization options here that if you want to allow people to search, if you want to kind of have current location appear, if you want a legend, if you want to allow map navigation. So this means that the person is not restricted, that they can scroll anywhere they want on the map. So oftentimes you may want to turn that off because you want to kind of keep the viewer's eye and information contained, right? Like you maybe don't want them going over to Russia if your map is focused on something in the United States. So once you have that, you can then actually begin adding features to the map. So if we zoom in here kind of over the US, you can see just some basic design tools up here at the top. So you can add points, you can add number points. So we can, put one there, right? You can see here that you can give it a name and a description, and you can kind of change the color. And so once you Once you save this, this point will be clickable so that if the user clicks on it, whatever you put in that description will appear. So then you can also draw lines, you can draw shapes, you can add text, which is really nice. So if we click there, so if you did something where you were doing a map of perhaps a flight you were getting ready to take, like, you know, if we pretend that we still fly, right? So if you have like an 8 a.m. depart, you can input that there. There's also the ability with the text that if you click underneath, you can then drag a little arrow to a point. So you could do something like this, and if you were like flying to Atlanta, you know, you could then use the arrow and draw it to Atlanta. And then you could add, you know, secondary text that says, you know, 10 a.m. Right, super easy, but you can make something that looks pretty nice. And again, this doesn't require any sort of GIS background to be able to do. So done. We can see, right, it just kind of auto puts it in there. And again, you can kind of manipulate the size of it a little bit. But if I click on that, it kind of expands. We kind of zoom in, you can see it kind of custom zooms, and you can kind of mess around with it. But are there any questions about anything so far? I know I'm moving fast, but we have an hour, so there's a lot to cover. But are there any initial questions about anything? Okay, so what I just discussed is what is kind of all falls under the media part of the content blocks. If you look at the last few, they have immersive content blocks. So these are the most dynamic. These are where you can really do some creative things. So the first one is a slideshow option, where you can add media. So you can add a video, you can add an image, you can add a map, and it is in the background. So let's go ahead and do this. It's typically going to autofill the whole area, which oftentimes is not what you want. So you can select the fit, do not crop option, and then you can change the background. You then get something that looks like this. You can then add text. And then you can keep building. So if you had a whole sequence of images or maps that you wanted to share with the viewer that are all tied to one another, this would be one way to share it with them, right? Is you click the plus sign, you get a second box, you then can add a second image. And again, it's going to kind of autofill it, and then you can kind of decide if you want to fit it. So you then get something that looks like this. So one thing I will note, like I personally am not the biggest fan of the slideshow option, because if we flip over to preview, everything is scrolling, right? That's kind of the way this platform is laid out. So you're moving up and down, and then you hit the slideshow option, and you're just kind of on autopilot to keep scrolling. And it's sometimes not intuitive to see that you're actually supposed to suddenly go vertical, and you're supposed to, or you're suddenly supposed to you know, move across, right? So I personally have looked at story maps where I got all the way through it and did not realize there was a section where I was actually supposed to kind of click left and right to be able to see all the different images. So just something to be mindful of. While it's a nice feature, I think it's easy to sometimes miss that there's extra stuff with it, because people just kind of are on the autopilot of going up and down. So the immersive block that I think is kind of the most interesting to work with is the next one, which is the sidecar. So you have the option to kind of have a floating panel or docked. So if you want the kind of text to be kind of stationary, or you can kind of move it around. With the floating one, it looks kind of similar to the slideshow, where you have this background that you can add media to and then kind of text over it. So what I like with this is I think it allows a little bit more kind of dynamic movement. So just for example, if we were to add a map, over to favorites. So this is a 1952 geo-referenced map of the DC area. So you get it, so it loads into this type of screen where you can kind of do a little bit of limited editing. You can edit it in ArcGIS by clicking out and then kind of save it and have the new one where you can work with it here a little bit. But what's really nice is you can choose the zoom level that you want the viewer to see first. So for example, let's say we want to start over the White House. So we can kind of zoom in. We can then place the map into our sidecar. And so this is where the viewer will start. So let's say we want to show them kind of some of the tourist spots of the DC area. So we can have White House. We can then either add a new map or a new image, or we can duplicate it, which is sometimes nice if you're just kind of working with the same material. So we can duplicate it and then select edit, and it's taking you back to that edit map screen. So then let's say you want to show people the zoo, right? So you can kind of move around and then zoom in over the zoo, and then you can change the text. Let me change. There we go. And so if we flip over to the preview, just to kind of show you what that looks like. Right, you start off with the White House, and then as they continue to scroll down, which to me is much more intuitive than the slideshow model, it then auto moves it, right? And I think that's kind of cool that you can kind of manipulate things so that the map is kind of being moved as the person scrolls through whatever information you want to share. The other thing that's kind of nice is you can easily incorporate video or photos to the text panel. So if you want to use your map as kind of your base of information, but then you have some photos that you want to incorporate, you can easily do that, right? So you basically can incorporate any of the content blocks that you can incorporate throughout the story map. So if you have an image, you can then, unfortunately, I don't have any DC images, but you can add that and it appears. You can, add video and different things like that. So that's, I think, a really nice, a nice feature to kind of play with. So the other thing that you can do with this that is kind of nice is, let's say you feel like it's a little heavy, the kind of scrolling and kind of auto changing on the map. Like you kind of maybe want your viewer to have a little bit more autonomy about what they see. You can use the content block, and this is only available in the sidecar. This isn't something that you can use throughout the story map, but it's called a map action. So what this does is it allows you to make a button that is tied to a specific part of your map, and when people click on that button, it will auto zoom the map for them. So for example, let's zoom out. So let's say you want to kind of show them this area. You can place the map, and then you can type in memorial, and let's do another one just to kind of show you here in it. Do this map here. So if we flip over to the preview, right, you kind of have the scrolling, and then you end up here. So you can click on the Lincoln Memorial if it wants to work, and it doesn't want to work. Oh dear. Let's go back. One other thing I will note, if you have a ton of images and maps, it can bog it down. So it sometimes does get really slow. So that is something to just to be aware of, that, especially when you share. I've found that if I share a map with someone, sometimes it will it will take a while for things to load. So let's see, why did you not want to work? Okay, let's try that again. Save action. There we go. So I think that it just had not saved that first one when I entered it. So let's try it again. we flip over to preview. And, you know, like with any of these types of programs, like patience is key because sometimes it doesn't work the way that you thought it would work. Okay, so you can see it's highlighted over the US Capitol because that's what we're looking at. And then if we flip over to the Lincoln Memorial, it auto moves the map, but it does give the user a little bit more autonomy. So you could envision having, you know, 5 or 6 of these buttons and people can kind of click through them, you know, as they want to. Okay, so the next, and you can also use images as the background. So you know, that, right? You can do images or videos. I think it lends itself really to the map background, especially if you kind of want to, you know, show people different things. So just something to be aware of. And then the last option is the map tour. So this is somewhat similar to the sidecar in the sense that you're typically kind of leading people through information about space. But you can see that it tends to kind of, I guess, better fuse the image with the map. So you have the option that you can start with an empty tour. You can upload photos that have been geotagged or have the kind of latitude, longitude coordinates embedded in the metadata, or you can connect it to your ArcGIS data. So if you start with an empty tour, you then can either do guided, which would be kind of, you know, chronological 1, 2, 3, or you can make it so folks can kind of explore in whatever order that they want to. You can then do map focused or media focused. So again, depending on how important the photos are, maybe you want them to be the focal point, or maybe you want it to be kind of more secondary and you want the map to be the focal point. So then you get this type of box, right, that has a map here in the corner that you can add locations to, and then you can upload things. So we zoom in here. Lexington. And add location this way, that's right. So you zoom in, you click add location, and then you can find your place. Let me zoom in here over Lexington. Click to add. You can add location, right? And then it's going to show it there, and then you can add whatever corresponding image you want to that. Got that. So kind of a flashback to the past week here on campus. You can see one of my snow photos I took last week as I was walking around. And then you can add text, and then you can keep going with your story, right? So you can see that in this case, because since I selected guided, it then shows 2, and then you can keep going. So a finished example of this that I think is really nice, if we go back to the COVID-19 and Indian country map, you can see that's how they made this here, right? You can see the 1 and then the information that they associate with that point. And as you scroll through, it then transitions to point 2, and the map moves slightly. And then if you keep scrolling, it transitions to point 3. You can see the total number of points here at the side. So this is made with the map tour option. That's how this was assembled. So you can see how nice it can really look. And it does do a nice job of really guiding the reader, which is, you know, something to really think about with your story map. So once you're done with your story map, so at this point, right, I've kind of very quickly talked about some of the different content builders. You can then publish it, like I said, and then it would be available depending on the options you set. So you can publish it and keep it private. You can publish it to your organization, which if you get the UK account, it would be anyone else who's part of that UK account, or you can make it available to everyone. And then once you have a series of stories, this is the kind of landing page when you log back in. So this is kind of the default page that shows you all the stories you've made. You can then click here to create new stories. There is an option to make more focused stories. So if you only want to do a sidecar, you can do that. If you only want to do a map tour, you can do that. So if you have sort of very specific focus in mind and kind of limited data, these options might make the most sense. Or you can do the kind of unlimited one, which is the start from scratch. There's also the ability to link story maps together through this feature called collections. So if you have, a series of story maps that are all kind of on the same theme and you want that to be apparent to the viewer, you can set things up where they're part of a collection. So then they're kind of tied to one another and they when people view them. So I know that's a lot of different pieces. But I hope you kind of got a sense for it's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, it's not something that you have to get a lot of technical knowledge to be able to do. You can kind of jump in and start making something very quickly. And like I said, if you have questions as you kind of try to make this, please feel free to shoot me an email and I'm happy to try to assist you. But are there any questions about anything that I've shared? Okay, well, awesome. Well, I think that that's kind of all I wanted to talk about, was to kind of give you guys a sense of how to, what story maps look like, and then B, kind of how do you begin assembling one. Hopefully at this point you do feel somewhat empowered to do that. And like I said, if you're interested in the UK license, when this is sent out with the video and then the PDF of the other information, you'll see directions for how you can request an account. But if there aren't any questions, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen.